In Franklin, North Carolina, on a bend of the Little Tennessee River, a mound rises out of a stretch of lawn between two intersecting roads, a parking lot on one side and a pharmacy on the other. It is close to 200 feet across at the base and stands a little over 15 feet tall, built up in layers of packed earth and clay that took generations to accumulate. Cars circle it on their way through town. Most drivers do not slow down, but the mound called Nikwasi has a distinction that almost no other earthwork of its size in the eastern United States can claim. It has never been excavated, not once. Not by the relic hunters who tore through hundreds of mounds across the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Basin in the 1800s looking for grave goods to sell. Not by the federal survey teams that spent 12 years and congressional money digging into more than 2,000 sites between 1881 and 1894. Not by any university archaeology department in the century and a half since. The town of Franklin holds the deed to the land beneath it. The Cherokee, whose ancestors built it and whose descendants still live within sight of it, have spent 2 centuries making sure the shovels never went in. What they were protecting, and what they said lived inside it, is where this has to start. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Mounds like Nikwasi are not unique to western North Carolina. They run from the Gulf Coast up through the Tennessee Valley, across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and into the Ohio country. Thousands of earthworks built over roughly 2,000 years by cultures archaeologists now divide into periods. Woodland communities raising burial and ceremonial mounds beginning well before the time of Christ, and the Mississippian societies that followed, building the great platform mounds between roughly the 9th and 16th centuries. Cahokia, across the river from modern St. Louis, held 10,000 people at its height, and a central mound larger in footprint than the base of the Great Pyramid. Etowah, in Georgia, has 3 mounds and a moat. Ocmulgee, in Macon, has a council chamber floor still intact beneath its earthen roof, the clay seats arranged in a circle exactly as they were left. At sites like these, where excavation did happen, archaeologists found the construction method repeated again and again. Basket loading, thousands of individual loads of soil carried in by hand and packed down in visible, distinct layers, sometimes different-colored clays brought from separate locations for reasons that were plainly ceremonial rather than structural. Radiocarbon dating at excavated platform mounds across the region generally places construction phases somewhere between the 8th and 16th centuries, with many mounds built up over generations, a new surface added, and an old one buried beneath it each time a chief died or a town was renewed. These were not tombs built in isolation. They were the civic centers of complex, populous agricultural societies, places where leaders were installed, where councils met, where the dead of high rank were laid to rest in stages over centuries. Nikwasi belongs to this tradition. 19th-century government surveyors measured it, sketched it, and listed it in their catalogue of southeastern earthworks without ever opening it, one of a small number of sites in their multi-volume report marked as observed but not excavated. Its construction likely began during the Mississippian period, built and rebuilt in layers as each generation added a new surface. By the time European traders reached the southern Appalachians in the 1700s, Nikwasi was already ancient, and it had become the ceremonial mound of one of the most important towns in the Cherokee Middle Settlements, a townhouse built on its flattened summit where councils were held and the sacred fire was kept. Of the tens of thousands of mounds once standing east of the Mississippi, the great majority have been plowed flat by agriculture, graded for highways, or leveled for parking lots and shopping centers over the past 200 years. Nikwasi is one of the few that never lost its shape, and one of even fewer whose original purpose survived alongside it in living memory rather than only in the ground. Further west, at Moundville in Alabama, excavation has turned up 29 platform mounds arranged around a central plaza, evidence of a population that peaked somewhere around the 13th century and then declined over the following 200 years for reasons still debated among archaeologists working the site today. At Spiro, in eastern Oklahoma, a single burial chamber inside one mound produced thousands of engraved shell gorgets, copper plates, and textile fragments, so well preserved that they rewrote assumptions about the reach of Mississippian trade networks when they were properly studied in the 1930s, decades after looters had already sold off an unknown fraction of what the chamber originally held. These sites give archaeologists the layered cross-sections Nikwasi has never allowed anyone to see, and the dating drawn from them, largely through radiocarbon analysis of charcoal and organic material sealed inside successive construction layers, has never once produced a date, a technique, or a material that falls outside what the ancestors of Mississippian-descended peoples are known to have possessed. No unidentified alloys, no artifacts sourced to a continent nobody in the region had contact with. Just soil, charcoal, shell, and copper worked by hand, treated with a consistency across thousands of miles that speaks to a shared religious and political tradition, not to outside intervention. None of this was controversial among the people who actually lived there. It became controversial in print. Beginning in the early 1800s, a wave of American writers, surveyors, and traveling lecturers put forward a theory that the mounds of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys could not have been built by the ancestors of the native peoples who lived among them. The Tennessee judge and antiquarian John Haywood, writing in 1823, speculated in print about a lost pre-Cherokee civilization connected to ancient Phoenicia. Caleb Atwater's 1820 survey of Ohio earthworks argued for a Hindu or Asian origin. Josiah Priest's 1833 book American Antiquities sold widely on the claim that a superior, vanished civilization had raised the mounds before being wiped out by the ancestors of the tribes Americans were now displacing. Traveling lecturers carried versions of the same claim from town to town for decades, and popular magazines repeated it as settled fact long after any serious investigation had been done. Even the more careful scholarship of the period carried the same hesitation. Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis published Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley in 1848, the first volume the newly founded Smithsonian Institution ever issued, and it remains a genuinely meticulous survey for its time, full of measured drawings and careful notes. Even so, its authors stopped short of crediting the ancestors of living native nations with the achievement laid out in their own maps, a hesitation that says less about the evidence in front of them than about what 19th-century American readers were prepared to accept. Newspapers in Georgia, during the years the state was pressing hardest to open Cherokee land to white settlement, ran editorials leaning on the same assumption, arguing in print that the region's ancient structures proved the current inhabitants were latecomers with no special claim to the ground beneath them. The theory had a use, and the timing was not incidental. It reached the height of its popularity in the exact years the United States government was formalizing the policy that would become Indian removal. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832 that the Cherokee Nation held sovereign authority over its own land, a ruling the Jackson administration simply declined to enforce. The Treaty of New Echota, signed in 1835 by a small faction with no authority to speak for the nation, was used as the legal pretext for removal anyway. In 1838, some 16,000 Cherokee were forced west along the route later called the Trail of Tears, and an estimated 4,000 of them did not survive the march. If the mounds scattered across that land were the work of some earlier, extinguished race, then the Cherokee Nation fighting in federal court to keep it had no deeper claim to the ground than any other recent arrival, a convenient argument for a government that had already decided the outcome it wanted. The people who stayed behind in the mountains of North Carolina, ancestors of today's Eastern Band, did so partly by hiding and partly by legal maneuvering that kept small parcels of land, including the ground around Nikwasi, out of the removal entirely. The myth outlived the political moment that made it useful. Even after serious scientific interest in the mounds developed later in the century, popular pamphlets sold at rail depots and early roadside attractions kept the lost race framing alive well into the 20th century, because a vanished, mysterious civilization sold more tickets than an accurate account of a living people's ancestors. Around the 50% mark of the full script, The Cherokee's own account of these mounds becomes the center of the story, and it does not match either the myth of a vanished superior race or the silence of the official record. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The ethnographer James Mooney spent long stretches of the 1880s and 1890s living among the eastern band Cherokee in the mountains around Nikwasi, working under a Bureau of Ethnology appointment to record the oral tradition before it was lost to English language schooling and Christian conversion. He worked mostly through interpreters, sitting with elders who gave him different versions of the same stories on different visits, and he cross-checked tellings against each other rather than settling for the first account he heard. His book, Myths of the Cherokee, published in 1900, remains the single largest written record of that tradition, and it preserves two stories that sit directly on top of the mound question. The first concerns a people the Cherokee called the Moon-eyed, said to have occupied the region before the Cherokee arrived, described as pale-skinned and unable to see well in daylight, living in stone-walled towns and driven out or absorbed after a period of conflict. An early account of this legend was recorded in 1797 by the naturalist Benjamin Smith Barton, based on information passed to him through the frontiersman and Tennessee governor John Sevier, who claimed Cherokee elders told him the Moon-eyed people, not the Cherokee, had built the old stone fortifications found in the region. 19th-century mound mythologizers seized on this fragment and inflated it into proof of a lost white or Welsh civilization. Exactly the story the political moment wanted told. What they left out, or never asked about, was the second and more specific tradition Mooney recorded, the story of the Nunnehi. The Nunnehi, in Cherokee tradition, are a spirit people, described as invisible unless they choose to be seen, living inside the earth in townhouses of their own that mirror the mounds and settlements of the visible world. Mooney recorded several locations across the mountains associated with Nunnehi dwellings, but the version tied most directly and most often to Nikwasi describes the town coming under attack by an enemy force. As the Cherokee defenders were about to be overrun, a company of warriors emerged from the mound itself, fought off the invaders, and then withdrew back into the earth, refusing any thanks or reward, because they were not living men, but the Nunnehi of Nikwasi, defending the town from within the ground they inhabited. Mooney recorded similar Nunnehi townhouse traditions attached to other mountains and mounds across the region, a network of inhabited places rather than a single isolated legend, which is part of why the Nikwasi version struck him as consistent rather than invented for the occasion. This is not a story about who built the mound in the sense an excavation report would answer. It is a story about what the mound was understood to be, not an inert pile of dirt left by a forgotten people, but an occupied place, ancestral and spiritually active, protected because disturbing it meant disturbing something and someone still there. That belief, not any external threat, is the most consistent explanation Cherokee community members have given for why the mound was never opened to the survey teams that dug into so many others. When Cyrus Thomas's Bureau of Ethnology Mound Survey moved through the South between 1881 and 1894, examining and in many cases opening more than 2,000 sites specifically to settle the lost race debate once and for all, Nikwasi was one of the sites his teams recorded from the surface and declined to dig. Thomas's final report, published in 1894, concluded exactly what Cherokee oral tradition had always held and what 19th-century popular writing had spent 70 years denying. The mounds were built by the direct ancestors of the native peoples living in and around them, not by any vanished outside race. The theory that had helped justify removal was, by the government's own extensive archaeological survey, wrong. Thomas's report ran to hundreds of pages and drew on excavation data from Ohio to Florida, and its central conclusion did not require speculation about isolated sites. It rested on pottery styles, burial customs, and construction techniques that traced continuously from the mounds into the material culture of documented historic tribes. A continuity the lost race theory had never been able to explain away except by insisting, without evidence, that the connection was coincidence. Reception was slower than the finding deserved. Some popular writers kept selling the older story for decades after Thomas's report closed the scientific question, because a vanished civilization remained a better headline than a congressional report most Americans never read. The closest Nikwasi itself came to destruction was not in the age of relic hunters but in 1946, when a development plan called for grading the mound down for building lots. Local residents, Cherokee and non-Cherokee, objected loudly enough that the plan was dropped, and the town of Franklin purchased the mound outright that same year, specifically to guarantee it would never be leveled by a future owner with no memory of what the objection had been about. What the Mooney legend actually preserves, once it is separated from the use later writers made of it, looks less like evidence of a lost white civilization, and more like an origin account describing an earlier regional population absorbed or displaced during the long transition from woodland to Mississippian life. The same kind of population turnover archaeologists now trace through pottery styles and settlement patterns across the whole Tennessee Valley. Cherokee tradition did not need outside confirmation to hold both ideas at once, that people who came before them once lived here, and that the mounds standing in their own towns were their own ancestors' work, inhabited still by the Nunnehi, and by the dead laid into their layers, worth keeping sealed for reasons that had nothing to do with hiding evidence and everything to do with respecting what was already known to be there. That protective instinct did not end with Mooney's generation. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians now operates its own Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and under federal law any ground-disturbing project near a documented site anywhere in the tribe's historic territory, Nikwasi included, requires consultation with that office before a permit is issued. It is a slower process than the 19th-century survey teams ever had to deal with, and that is largely the point. Where Cyrus Thomas's crews once needed only a shovel and a congressional appropriation to open a mound, anyone proposing to disturb ground near Nikwasi today has to answer to the descendants of the people who built it, a reversal that would have been unthinkable to the antiquarians who spent the 1800s arguing that those descendants had no claim to the land at all. Nikwasi still stands in the middle of Franklin today, fenced with a low iron rail, a plaque at its base, the summit kept clear of brush by regular mowing. For most of the 20th century, it was owned outright by the town, a piece of municipal property surrounded by businesses that grew up around it without ever being allowed to build on it. In 2019, the town transferred stewardship of the mound to the Nikwasi Initiative, a partnership formed with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and the surrounding counties, specifically to return meaningful care of the site to Cherokee hands, the first formal step of its kind in the mound's recorded history. The coalition's stated mission runs beyond the mound itself toward interpretive signage, educational programming, and a longer-term effort to knit Nikwasi back together with other historic Cherokee town sites scattered along the same river valley, many of them marked today by nothing more than a name on a map. Cherokee community members now hold gatherings at its base that would not have been permitted there a generation ago, drumming and speeches carrying across a stretch of grass that spent most of the last century hemmed in by gas stations and storefronts that never quite crossed onto its footprint. No shovel has gone into it under the new arrangement either, and no one involved in managing the site has proposed that one should. Visitors who climb the short path to the summit today find a flat circle of mowed grass, a view over the rooftops of downtown Franklin, and nothing that looks, at first glance, like it could carry the weight of 2 centuries of argument about who owns the right to a continent's past. That is easy to miss if you are only looking for artifacts. The mound was never short on evidence. It was short on people willing to listen to the evidence that was already being offered, freely, by the community that had never stopped living beside it. The moon-eyed people, whoever they were, are a fragment of a much older story that 19th-century writers bent to a purpose it was never meant to serve. The mound builders, in case anyone still needs it said plainly, were the ancestors of the people who still live along that river, and the warning the Cherokee carried about Nikwasi was never a mystery waiting to be solved by a survey team. It was an instruction, kept for 200 years, about ground that was never empty to begin with, and it is still being kept. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now, I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.